What's up, everybody? Today we're making a fantasy-inspired belt pouch with a drawstring. You can find the artwork and patterns for all my projects on my website and my Etsy shop, link in the description down below. You can also find the same pattern and artwork month to month on my Patreon, so have a look at that. This video is sponsored by LONSDALE Leather. Be sure to check their link out in the description for tools, supplies, and of course, leather. I'm using a 5-ounce vegetable tan here because I want to be able to carve this project, and it will give me more options when it comes to coloring. It's a little more finicky when you're dealing with the back side of your leather, so you got to make a call if you want to carve it and how much you care about being able to make your item whatever color you want, or if you want to go with something that's already fully dyed. You might be able to go 6-7 ounce on some of these parts, but I wouldn't go too much heavier. After we're done cutting out all these pieces, I'm going to bevel both sides. I'm going to use a very small beveler, number 1. Depending on where you buy your beveler from, that number 1 could mean a few different things for sizing, so you may have to experiment a little bit until you figure out which one you like. But if you're going with a 5-ounce leather, definitely keep your bevel small, because we want to burnish and round these edges off eventually. And if you put too much of a bevel on there, you're going to get a really sharp edge. Now for the gusset of this project, I went with some black deer tan cowhide. Deer tan is a great substitute for actual deer. It's a little bit heavier, but still just as soft. It's got a great finish. It's also less stretchy than regular deer, more consistent. You can get it in larger sides, obviously. And it's cheaper. Now I'm using a bell skiver here because I'm going to do a rolled edge on this. And in my pattern, there will be both a rolled edge version where you can bell skive it. Most of you guys don't have a bell skiver. Or just a regular edge, so don't sweat it too much. Now I'm just going to fold over all my edges with some double-sided tape. And then I'm snipping off one layer of where all these edges join, just to make it a little less bulky. Hit it with my rubber mallet, make sure everything's nice and flat, and then it's time to carve my project. So I wet my whole piece because I want to make sure there's no strange discoloring when I wet stuff. And then I'm just going to put this simple knot on. I'm just using my favorite stylus to get this indented into the leather before I carve it. Figuring out how wet you like your leather takes practice, but I generally don't like it too wet. That is to say that the surface itself is not dry, but cool to the touch, and it's still got a wet core. Make sure you keep your blades polished. The more angled your blade, the easier it is to do sharp turns. I almost exclusively, no, that's not true at all. I exclusively use this blade. I don't use anything else. I don't see a reason to at this point. Maybe eventually I will, but it turns really well. I can get good tight circles, and it stays pretty sharp. Once we've got all these cuts done, it's time for our beveling. Just make sure you have nice consistent hammer strikes, working your way around your project until completion. I also will rub my beveler along the area that I've beveled to smooth it out a little bit if it's looking slightly inconsistent. I also do this along the top edge where the flat surface of the piece starts to bevel, because often there is a line there and I want it to round off nicely, so I'll do a little rub up there to get rid of that line. I wasn't sold on how I was going to do this yet, so I waited till now to put this in. I throw those holes in there to round the corners slightly, and it makes it a lot easier to bevel too, obviously. This is a light brown Pro Phoebix dye. The Pro dye dye's way lighter, and I wanted a nice, even light brown as my base for this project, because I decided that in the middle of a video would be the best time to experiment, and I wanted to do some airbrushing with a dark brown around the edges. Because I'm going to be going around the edge with a airbrush and a dark brown, I'm using that same dark brown here. The plan with the airbrush is to make an antiqued gradient look to the edge. So I'm going to feather it along, supposedly, and give it a really cool look. Obviously, any of you guys that watch my channel regularly certainly know that if it has dye that goes through it or a finish that goes through it, I don't take care of it very well. So I'm happy that this airbrush was still working when I set it up for the first time in a few years. So it's pretty obvious what I'm doing here. I'm spraying on an angle, and I'm trying to spray off of the piece a little bit and then work my way back to get that gradient. While it's wet, it looks really cool. When it dried, it looks a little less cool, but it still worked out the way I had hoped. But I'll need to experiment a little bit to make sure I get the most contrast next time. Most people, when they're doing edges, have access to beeswax, so I did this beeswax edge. I wasn't sure about using the tokonol that I started using last project, and I wasn't sure if the tokonol was as good as I had thought it was, so I did a little experiment. I did beeswax first, which all of you guys will have access to. There's also an edge compound called gum tragacanth, I think is how it's said. I always forget how it's said. But I decided to use tokonol again, use a dauber instead of my finger, and tokonol is amazing. I would recommend it wholeheartedly to anybody. Supposedly there's a place in North America selling it now, because you could only get it in Japan before. If it's not in the description of this video, be sure to ask me here and I'll put it in. I might be forgetful. Well, I am forgetful. As you can see here, after I apply it with the dauber, I wipe it away with a piece of paper towel just to get rid of any excess so it doesn't get all over the place. It seems to work pretty well. After we're done burnishing all of our pieces, we're going to do a little buff with some sheep's wool to get rid of any marks or inconsistencies. And then in theory we're going to move on to our next piece, but we forgot to do this part. That's a lot of tokonol. But I came up with an amazing idea. It's either going to work or be a disaster. Alright, you would be absolutely amazed at how impressed with myself I was for that. Unlike my airbrush, my spray gun is a disaster, so this spray job is a little inconsistent, but I get it done. I'm also using that Angelus matte finish because I'm going to be doing some painting like you see here. And I'm using Angelus paints, so I might as well stay consistent. Probably not totally necessary, but whatever. So I think this is some taupe color. I'm going to do it's still a pretty light color, but I'm going to go around the whole knot in one shade and then lighten it slightly. And then do another shade on top, but not as much area, to kind of give it a little more of a 3D look. I was very tempted to take my Warhammer painting miniatures years and add even more highlights to these knots, but I think I was going to start getting a little ridiculous. And part of the charm of this paint job is anybody can do that. You guys can all do that paint job, no problem. Then I do another awkward protective coat of Angelus. I decided to experiment again. I had originally dyed the back of all these pieces with dark brown pro dye, but I'm doing dark brown alcohol-based dye because I wanted it really dark and consistent looking. And then I'm putting some tokonol on top, which I've never done before. Again, great time to do this kind of stuff in the middle of a video for people. The only problem was I had bleed through from the back around that cut square into the front, and I had to work some magic, which I wasn't recording on, with some paint to touch it up a little bit. So just be careful around that edge. Don't go crazy. Then after that, I spray everything with the finish again. I decided to put a stone on here. It's about 1 inch long, and the size of the stone will obviously change the size of this hole. The hole needs to be smaller than the stone so it's secure, and you should experiment on how you want to cut this hole with scrap first. And also cut the hole well before you dye and put a finish on this, just in case you screw it up. It can be really finicky. Now I'm just going to rough up the leather and rough up the stone and apply some 5-minute epoxy. This is also something I've never done before, not the 5-minute epoxy, but adding a stone to my work. So this is just another experiment for this project. I do a lot of machine sewing. I have sewing machines. I'm going to use them. But for this pattern, I'll have a lot of spots where you can rivet instead of sew, and this is one of those spots for sure. I'm picturing 3 or 4 rivets, plus that epoxy on the stone or glass, whatever you're using, should hold it just fine. I've modified the pattern once again for where I want to place my belt loops. This may be a little different on the final pattern, but for now this is what I'm going with. Once again, this is a spot that would be just fine for rivets, but I've decided to use my sewing machine because I'm going to stay consistent through this project. Things go a little ass backwards here, but I wanted to leave this footage in just because it kind of amuses me. I've marked the center point and the edge ends for my gusset, and I'm going to stitch it on. The original plan was to stitch the whole gusset on, and then, for some reason, sew the center strip on afterwards. And I was just going to slowly invert the pouch and keep sewing it, because that seemed like the perfect solution to this. And it definitely was not. I also forgot to sew the edge of my gusset for the pouch entry area, so I've cut away and sew my edge. Again, you won't need to do this if you are not skiving it, or if you do not have an incredibly thin leather. And then I just gotta sew those edges up again. Yeah, easy, everything's perfect. No problem. We're gonna mark a spot for the keeper and quickly sew it on. Once that's done, it's time to somehow sew this center strip onto a pouch and gusset that is already assembled. Let me repeat that. Already assembled. Well, let's give it a try. There definitely has to be a better way of doing this, and I was gonna leave it. I had managed to sew the top edge and then down 3/4 of the center strip, and then awkwardly sewed the back onto it. But there was a big spot where it wasn't stitched at all, and it just looked like, well, it looked like ass. So I did the only reasonable thing, and I once again started to disassemble my project. So for the sake of this tutorial, pretend none of that happened. We're just gonna go back in time as if I have not stitched the gusset on yet completely. All I've done so far is I've stitched the gusset on just at the bottom there. Just like it is now, just a straight across. And then we just go around this whole thing and stitch it down. This will be beautiful. But my camera dies. Just go all the way around that center strip. You start at the top, you go all the way down to the little point, and go all the way back up the other way. That is also another part that can be riveted on, and I'll have the rivet marks in the pattern. And once we've got that on, we can stitch both sides of the gusset separately, and everything works out really nice. The last thing to do is to make your drawstring. You need 2 separate sides, put a point. I'm tapering it here just to make sure the knot is as small as possible, and then I'm going to thread it through the back of my pouch like this here. And then it's got a nice tiny knot because I cut it down. Then you just thread it all through both sides of your project. Tie another knot to make sure that it doesn't slide out the other side, or put something on there to stop it from sliding out. The ends of these laces is a good spot to add a little individualization to your project. Maybe some beads, maybe some sinew or bone bits or something cool. All I do is tie some knots, and then I cut the lace in half. Done. Make sure you hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for future videos, hit that notification button so you don't miss any of my content, and until next time, keep on being creative in whatever it is you do.